So now that we've talked about all of the anatomy and we've talked about it as it relates to yoga, we're going to come back and do another review really specifically looking at the yoga poses and really the important information as a yoga teacher. So I'm going to have Amanda come into Virabhadrasana B, Warrior B. I'm going to have you face that way. And I want you to consider, imagine yourself in this pose here, and you can maybe even just think about this Warrior B pose in your experience and think first about what is strengthening. Not just what's shortening, but what gets tired first. So that as you consider coming into Warrior B, probably the first thing you might consider are these guys here. Right? We've got the quadriceps. Amanda's smiling because she can feel that now. We've got the quadriceps contracting, one of the first things that gets tired. But then also one of the common cues we look at here, and I'll have you switch sides and turn your back toward them. Well, same side, yeah. One of the first things that we look at here is also this alignment of the hip. One of the first cues we use is wrap the hip or draw the hip in, which will help to track the knee forward, right? And we have what muscle group here that's contracting to draw the hip into the socket to steer the knee forward. Remember, we've got piriformis, the go-go cues, that whole external rotator group drawing the hip into the socket. So the two primary ones we're looking at, and then a little bit of the quadriceps on the back leg too. Great, now just turn around and flip this way, so left side. Now consider as well, what muscles do you think are going to be stretching in Warrior B? Not a pose we feel a lot of stretch, but if you consider what it would feel like to feel really tight in this pose, you might be able to start to think about some of the areas that might be lengthening. So I'm going to have you do the left side, but face that way. So if you think about this here, a lot of what you'll see is happening on the front side of the body. So we have this adductor group lengthening in order to allow the knee to turn forward. And maybe even a little bit of a stretch here through the front of the hip, the iliopsoas here, and maybe even some through the inner thigh. And those are going to be the main areas, in addition to potentially some through the calf. And part of this depends on where primarily your student is tight, or yourself in the pose. Great. Come on up for me there. I'm going to have you come into right side reverse warrior. So now we're coming back to a similar base. We've got similar muscles that are contracting and lengthening in the lower part. So we've got Virabhadrasana B in the lower part of the leg. Now we're adding on the upper part here. So think again about what's going to get tired. What's strengthening or contracting here? And one of the first things you might consider, if you were to think about coming into this, would be this side. And we've got two muscles in particular contracting here, the obliques and the quadratus lumborum. I'm going to have you come on up and just spin your left leg, spin around to the left side. We'll even her out here. Great, now as she switches sides, start to consider what's stretching now in this pose. And it's helpful to just think about your own experience in reverse warrior. So again, we look to these tissues on the side, the obliques and the QL, but then we also see a stretch coming up through here. Remember what's stretching as she rotates the pinky toward the ground into external rotation. We're setting up the lats to be stretched a little bit more, the internal rotator as she externally rotates. So other than the legs, that's going to be the primary points there. Come on up. I'll have you come into crescent lunge and face that way with your right foot forward. Now again, consider, and you can always pause the video as we go through this, but consider what's going to get tired here. What's strengthening? Again, we come back to the quadriceps. But we also come back to this idea of different styles, different cues, different focal points. We might be finding some in the back quadriceps as well. Clearly there's a lot happening in the abdominals and in the back here. And it depends on how I'm articulating the pose. So I'll have you, why don't you just switch sides, stay facing that way. So what's the muscle, if she comes into this hyperlordosis, if she lets her low back kind of sag, what is the muscle that's going to try and draw her ribs back, so as she knits the ribs back? Remember, as she knits the ribs back, we've got the upper rectus abdominis. Now, as she lengthens her tailbone, we also see the lower rectus abdominis. Now, if she thinks about drawing in around the waist and getting taller there, we're going to see which muscle kick in. Remember, the transverse abdominis. Now, why don't you switch back to your right side? And let's think about what's stretching here. So first off, what's the first thing you think of stretching in the lower half of the body? For most of us, the biggest thing that pops out is the left side hip flexor. So her iliopsoas here, which could also be a little bit rectus femoris and TFL, but potentially the biggest one is going to be iliopsoas. Now, as she sets the abdominals, remember that's also going to put the psoas in a position to lengthen even more. Great, go ahead and switch sides one more time. And let's look to the upper body. So as she engages the abdominals we looked at before, knitting the front ribs back and lengthening the tailbone, it's going to put the psoas in a position to lengthen more. Now look to her chest. What do we have lengthening in the upper part of her body here? Remember, there's two muscles primarily that are lengthening as she lifts her arms up. We've got the lats allowing her to lift her arms up, as well as the pec major. Great. Come on out of it for us, sir. Next, let's look at some where she's bearing weight on the arms. So I'm going to have Amanda just come down to a seat here for a moment. And what I want you to do first is to visualize yourself. I want you to just close your eyes for a moment and visualize yourself coming into side plank or Vashisthasana. So visualize yourself coming into this with your right hand on the floor with any modification you prefer. So if you like one of the legs on the ground, but feel the lifting of the hips. And I want you to visualize this. It's helpful as a teacher to be able to visualize without having to do the pose. So you can have that really vivid awareness of what the pose feels like. And to consider first, if you were to stay in Vashisthasana for a while, what would get tired first? Okay, and then open your eyes, and I'll have Amanda come into Vashisthasana with her right hand down here. And consider there's a few places that will probably get tired here. We've got a few points. This is a full body pose. So the first part we're going to look at is the shoulder. And clearly, what's the superficial muscle here that's going to be working to some extent to hold her up? Remember, we've got the deltoid that's working to abduct the arm as she pushes the floor away and lifts her ribs up. And then what's the group of muscles that's helping to position the head of the humerus in the socket? Remember, we've got the rotator cuff. Now, the tendency here for most people is to roll forward in the shoulder, and what we're trying to do is externally rotate a touch, which is the muscle in particular that's going to externally rotate to draw the humerus back into the socket here. Remember, we've got infraspinatus. Great. Why don't you turn and face the other back way there on your left hand? So remember, we also have the scapular stabilizers helping to stabilize that foundation. And remember, what were the two muscles we saw here? We had the serratus and the rhomboids. Though they probably won't be the muscles you feel first for most of us. However, it is a big part of the strength that's happening here to prevent that winging. Now let's look in the lower part of the body. Why don't you set your top foot on the ground in front of you? And as she pushes down through that left outer foot, whether the legs are stacked or not, what's engaging to help lift the hips here? What's going to get tired in the lower body? When you were visualizing this, besides the arm, what started to get tired? Remember, we've got the abductor here, gluteus medius, and then what's engaging here to support her? We've got the obliques and the quadratus lumborum. Great, come in down and take a rest there. So now pause again for a second and close your eyes and visualize yourself coming into Vashisthasana. And why don't we say the right hand's on the ground again. And visualize yourself pushing through your feet to lift your hips and see if you can just notice if there are areas that you feel a stretch in. And then open your eyes. Come back into the right side, and you can put the top foot on the floor in front of you. Now again, there's a lot of modifications here. So she could have the foot on the floor, she could have the bottom knee on the ground, we could have them stacked, but it's a similar pose. So there's not a huge stretch here, but as we start to lift the hips up, there's this opening through the left side of the body here. Some people will feel a little stretch to the hip, and if that foot's on the ground, maybe I even feel some in the rotators. If she stacks the feet up there and lifts the hips, she might feel a little bit of stretching through the side of the body here, through the obliques, the QL, and if she reaches her arm forward, where might she also feel it in her shoulder? Great, we've got the lats. She can rest there for a second. The latissimus dorsi lengthening, especially as she turns the pinky finger toward the ground. So in all of these poses, it's going to depend on the student and where they're more tight or more weak, how it shows up and how they feel it. In fact, even in something like Posses, the quadriceps are going to be somewhat active, and many different parts of the body will be contributing to that. But we can see really, especially in Posses, as she's facing to the side here, that a lot of these side body muscles here are contracting on one side and lengthening somewhat on the opposite side. And we talked about this as them working together, remember, being antagonists to each other. So, next, I'm going to have her come into plank. But let's just have her drop her knees to the ground while we just look. So let's start with the upper body here. Remember, what are the important points of stabilizing the shoulder? Anytime she's weight bearing, whether she's in crow or plank pose or chaturanga, we've got some main features here, right? We've got two things stabilizing the scapula, serratus and rhomboids, and then the rotator cuff positioning the head of the humerus. What's the part of the rotator cuff that helps to draw the humerus back into the socket? Remember, infraspinatus, and we see that here, literally contracting to pull the humeral head back. Why don't you roll forward just a little bit, and then contract to pull the humeral head back into the socket so that it's right in the center of the socket there. Great, rest there for a second. Now, plank pose really is a full body pose. So there's a lot happening here. In fact, if you can close your eyes for a moment, this is one you can usually visualize very easily. If you were to stay in plank beside your arms, what else would get tired here? So as she comes into plank, we already have an idea in our head. There's going to be two main focal points. We've got the shoulders, which we talked about, and the deltoids, remember, and all the surrounding tissues are going to be part of that. But what do I have contracting here to prevent her from dipping down? So as she drops down a little bit there, right? I've got the abdominals, especially rectus abdominis, knitting the ribs, lengthening the tailbone, the upper and lower rectus abdominis, and that drawing in of transverse abdominis. Then what's happening down here? Remember, we've got the quadriceps engaging to help lift and tone the legs there. Good, relax down there for me. Remember, in the arms, we also have the deltoids and the pecs, which are a big part of that as we place the hands on the floor in front of us. Great. So let's come back to a couple of standing poses again, and we'll come back up for triangle pose. So we'll stand up for triangle pose. And before she comes into it, again, I want you to close your eyes and visualize yourself in right side triangle. And this time, think about what you feel engaging or maybe tiring if you stay there long enough, as well as what you feel stretching. Great, so I'll have her come into right side triangle. Again, we want to look at a few points. Part of this really does depend on different styles and different cues and what we pay attention to. There's a few key points here. We've got the quadriceps engaging here as we straighten the leg. We have the left side abductors, the gluteus medius, pressing this foot into the ground to keep this leg active so she's not sagging into the hips there. Then we've got The movement of the pelvis here happening, so the knitting of the ribs and the lengthening of the tailbone to help turn her into the side-facing orientation. And then what muscle is going to help to rotate the rib cage here to turn her chest up toward the ceiling? Remember, we have the obliques helping to rotate and position the rib cage. Right, come on up and just switch sides. So now as she comes into this, what do we have stretching here through the front side of the body here? Remember, we've got pec major. But look at what else is happening with the scapula. Notice that the left side, in fact, why don't you turn and put your left foot facing that way so they see your back side. Notice that as she comes into this, in order to open the chest, there's a little bit of scapular retraction happening on this right side, and then this protraction happening on the left side. And what that does is it creates this spiral motion to help rotate her rib cage with the obliques. And what that means is that one side, this right side rhomboid, is shortening, while the left side rhomboid is lengthening. And the right side serratus is lengthening, while the left side serratus is contracting. And that opposition pulls her into this corkscrew motion with the help of the obliques to help spiral her open to turn her rib cage toward the ceiling. Great, come on up and just switch sides. Put your right foot forward there. Now let's also just consider what's happening in the legs, what's stretching now in the legs. So if you think about what's stretching in this pose, and again, this is really going to depend on each student's experience of what's tight in their body. But the biggest thing that's going to stand out here is going to be the inner thigh muscles and the inner hamstrings. So we've got semimembranosus and tendinosus, as well as the adductor group here. We're also relatively, remember, stretching some of the obliques and some of the serratus and rhomboid muscles here, as well as the pecs and the chest. So you can see how all the muscles work together to help create this symphony effect in a pose. Great, come on up, Amanda. Now for this next one, I'm going to have her stand up for a moment there, because this one will happen quickly. I'm going to have her come into Digasana or Warrior C. So remember with this one, what I'm trying to do is square the hips and come forward. So I want you to just take a moment and visualize this one. This one, for most of us, doesn't take very long to fatigue in. And for most of us, the first thing we feel is the things going on in the hips. If we're able to stay long enough, we might start to feel some in the core, the chest, the back. And just try and collect as many of those parts that you feel fatigue as you can, that you feel engaged to support. And I'll have her come into Digasana here, either leg facing this way. Now think about the muscles of the hip first. So what's engaging here? We've got the gluteus medius contracting to keep her from laying into the hip here. We also have the gluteus maximus on this back leg. As she squares the hips here, the gluteus maximus raising the back leg. Now what else is working with the gluteus maximus on the right side here? We've got the hamstrings. We also have the gastroc here. Great, come on up. Pause there for a second. So we have this whole back chain of the leg that's lifting against gravity, that's contracting as I square the hips. If I unsquare the hips, the rotators start to kick in. The external rotators start to kick in here as I come into Warrior C. So what I'm trying to do is square the hips so that I have gluteus medius hugging the hip into the socket and gluteus maximus, hamstrings and gastroc, lifting the back leg. Now let's look at the upper half of it. So why don't you just switch legs and come into the other side. Now, if that weren't an issue, which for most of us that's what we feel, we also have some things happening in the upper body. So think about the abdominals, rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis cinching in. What else is contracting to pull her up against gravity with the spine? Remember, we have the erector spinae muscles. Now, what also in this variation with her arms externally rotating and her scapula drawing back, rhomboids, middle traps, erectors, external rotators, and infraspinatus will have her relax there. So there's a lot of things contracting in all of these, and there's not always a right or wrong answer here. Part of it depends on the alignment, the cues, what I'm paying attention to. And as a yoga teacher, this is where I get to pick and choose what's going to be most helpful within that context of that class or for that student. Clearly, with Digasana, we could also focus more on the extension, targeting which muscle? The erector spinae group, versus thinking more to lengthen and focus more on the abdominals and also the hips here. So there's a lot of different ways to target different muscles or to bring mindfulness to different parts of the body that tend to maybe go a little bit more dormant. Great, now let's look at half moon, another one that's going to go pretty fast. So I want you to visualize this one first. So we'll visualize the right leg pointing forward, coming into half moon, and I want you to think about in your own practice what gets tired. Start with the obvious things, and then start to notice if you were able to stay in it, what else might get tired. Also notice what you feel stretching. And feel free to pause the video and stay there a little bit longer if you like. Otherwise, I'm going to have Amanda come into the right side forward. So notice what's engaging here on this lifted leg against gravity pushing down on her. We have gluteus medius. And then we also have, as she gets lighter on that hand, which she can keep her hand on the floor now, I also have obliques and quadratus lumborum. Now switch legs and turn away from them. Now in this standing leg, as she turns to the side, keep this leg parallel there. As she turns to the side of her mat, what's contracting here to draw her hip into the socket here and to turn her left foot forward? Remember, we've got external rotation in this hip to turn the left foot forward. And so our piriformis and external rotators are contracting. And a lot of times that's a lot of what we feel as well. Great, relax for me and switch sides again. Now, usually with this one, most of what we feel is the muscles getting tired. But there are some things stretching as well. Primarily, we've got this area. So what do we have stretching in here? We've got both the inner hamstring, semimembranosus and tendinosus, as well as the adductors, and potentially some through the hip flexor and maybe the adductors on this side. And then lastly, we've got the chest, so the pecs, and potentially even the obliques to help turn her up. Great, thank you. Now let's come up to stand and think about a couple of different standing poses, a couple last standing poses before we transition to the floor. So the first one's a really simple one. I'll just demo this one here. Tree pose here. If I come to stand on my right leg, what muscles are going to contract, or what muscle is going to contract to draw the hip into the socket? Which one primarily will hug the hip in? Remember, this is going to be gluteus medius. Now, which muscle group is it working with as I think about pushing my foot and my thigh into each other? And I feel the adductor group turn on. So I feel the abductors and adductors engage to center the hip in the socket. What else might I feel getting tired here? Remember, I'm standing upright, so the quadriceps might also be one. My left hip is externally rotating. So a lot of that's happening more passively, but there is some shortening happening in the left side rotators. So you might potentially feel a little bit there, though most of what you're going to feel is going to be the centering of the standing leg. Stretch-wise, inner thigh, so adductors are going to be the focal point in this kind of groin area as well. Then one last standing balancing pose. Let's look at dancer's pose. So I'll have Amanda come onto her right leg and face this way. And she'll grab the opposite leg behind her. And we'll come into this one right away and think about what's engaging, what's contracting here. So clearly we've got one thing happening here, quadriceps here. And then to support the lower back, what do we have contracting here? Remember, rectus abdominis and transverse abdominis. All right, come on out there. Switch sides. Now there's one muscle that's eccentrically contracting as she kicks the foot into her hand. There's actually a couple here, right? One of them, look at the bend in the knee and the extension of the hip. So we've got rectus femoris, eccentrically contracting, meaning it's engaging as she kicks the foot into her hand, but it's also lengthening. We also see that in the psoas a little bit as well. More lengthening than anything, but as she kicks back into the foot, there might be a little bit of that contraction. Great, come on up and just switch sides one more time. One more area that's stretching here. What's stretching on the shoulder? Pec major, anterior deltoid, maybe even the biceps. Great, come on up. Now let's head down to the ground and do some lower to the floor poses here. Great, so I'm gonna have Amanda come into Gomukhasana, either leg you prefer on top. Just the legs. So now that you're catching on to this, I'm going to give you a little pause to consider and think. First off, when we look at the legs, what's the primary thing being stretched here? Remember, as we come down to the floor, most of this is more passive, so it's not going to be as much in the strengthening side as much as the flexibility. Remember, the knees are adducting, so the primary thing we're looking at here is gluteus medius lengthening to allow the knees to come together. However, we're also externally rotating the legs, so what else might also be stretching here as she folds forward even? Remember, externally rotating, this was the one exception we talked about. As she folds forward, she's going to be stretching the external rotators. So the piriformis might also be where she feels it in that kind of bullseye in the back of the hip, or she might feel it more through the side of the hip and glute medius down through the IT band. Come on up, and then will you turn this way? And I'm going to have you do the arm variation. So legs however you like. Yeah, do the opposite side. So in Gomukhasana arms, remember in Gomukhasana arms, she's got her left arm up. So the left arm is rotating which way? Remember, this top arm is going to be externally rotating to bring the arm up overhead, and the bottom arm is going to be internally rotating. So what are we stretching on the left arm, the top arm here? Remember, because it's externally rotating, it's going to stretch the internal rotator. So we know subscapularis is going to be part of that. What else is lengthening as she just brings the arm up overhead? Remember, we've got latissimus dorsi. We also have potentially the pec stretching here as she brings the arm up overhead. And then as she bends the elbow, what else might be stretching here as well? Remember, we have the long head of the triceps crossing the shoulder, so the triceps are part of that too. So let's have her switch arms just so she can stay even there. And let's talk about the lower arm. So on the lower arm now, she's internally rotating as she brings the arm back. So we're stretching the external rotator. So potentially the main target here is going to be, or the main area that she feels it is going to be the infraspinatus, the external rotator. Though for most people, they'll feel it more around the head of the humerus. So it's not always indicative of exactly where you feel it, but the infraspinatus is going to be limiting this range of motion. So for someone who, if you let go there, for someone who's unable to bind here, when this arm seems fairly normal, we know that a lot of the limitation here is coming from that external rotator. Even though they might not feel it back here, what I'm looking at is that limitation coming from the rotation and that restriction of infraspinatus. Great. Now, for this next one, I'm going to have Amanda just have a seat here. She's going to prepare for reverse tabletop. So I'm going to have her step her feet in front of her and her hands behind her. So first off, before she comes into it, I'm going to have her lift and puff the chest. Now, what muscle did we talk about creating that lifting and puffing? Remember, adducting, internally rotating, and extending to puff up the chest. We had the latissimus dorsi. Now, as a result, what also is stretching there? Remember the pec major, also maybe even the front of the deltoid. Now, as she lifts up in the lower body, what's going to be lifting her up here? Remember, we have two main things, gluteus maximus and the hamstrings. Now, what else is going to be holding her up with the shoulders as she pushes down and back? We've got lats still, posterior deltoid, and even a little bit with the triceps. Great, come on down and relax. Now you can imagine some of the things that are stretching. We've already talked about a little bit here through the front of the shoulder, the deltoid and the pecs. You might feel a little bit through the abdominals. For most of us, there's not a huge extension in the spine happening, and maybe a little bit through the hip flexors. For the most part, a lot of strength for many of us, and then opening in the shoulders. So for this next one, I'm going to have her lie on her stomach and head down here. Now, if we just think about Cobra before she comes up here, remember what we're looking at here is her body, her chest lifting up in resistance to gravity. So gravity's pushing down on her. So the primary thing we're thinking about first is the erector spinae muscles helping to lift her chest up here. Now, the rest of it is somewhat going to depend on what she focuses on what I'm cueing or what she's paying attention to. Let's have her do it this way. Draw the shoulders back. So what's creating that here? Rhomboids and middle traps. Maybe even a little bit of the infraspinatus to draw the head of the humerus back. And then as she starts to lift up, we feel the erectors come online right away, pretty much no matter what style or variation you're doing, unless she's just laying in the arms there. So as she extends the spine. Great, now as she comes back down, the next thing we're going to look at is now setting the pelvis. So as she presses the pubic bone into the ground, what is she going to feel turn on there to create that? Lower rectus abdominis, right? If she were to draw on around the waist, she'd feel transverse abdominis. And as she does that, it's going to help set the pelvis so that as she comes up, maybe she'll feel a little bit more of that extension as she lifts up and through the chest. And as she pushes down and back through her hands, she's really going to feel the arms and really primarily the triceps as she draws the hands back to open the chest. So the triceps engage, and then what opens here? Pecs major and anterior delt. Great, then she can come on down. Now, as she sets the pubic bone down, what we'll also feel is that connection of the front of the leg pressing into the ground. So this time what I'm going to have her do is come into Shalabhasana, and we'll consider what's engaging now as she lifts the legs up. So we've already talked about the upper body is going to be pretty much the same. As she comes into Shalabhasana and lifts up, we've got a similar scenario happening here, but now we also have what's engaging down here. Remember, we have two things primarily, hamstrings, gluteus maximus, and then the erector spinae and the whole posterior shoulder we talked about. Come on down and relax. So this is a great one to look at this balance of the front and the back of the body. As she lifts up against gravity, gravity is pushing her down. So the whole back side of the body to some extent is contracting to lift her up, regardless of what I'm thinking about there. So potentially even the gastrocs, the hamstrings, the gluteus maximus, the erector spinae muscles, and then to open her chest, if she's focusing on that, the rhomboids, middle traps, the posterior deltoid, and the infraspinatus, all engaging to open the chest here. So stretching when she comes into that is going to be potentially anything on the front side. So the pecs, the delts, the abdominals, particularly rectus abdominis here. Maybe even she'll feel a little through the front of the hip flexors. For most of us though, because we're actively extending the spine, most of what we're going to feel is the activation through the back side of the body. Now, if she engages the abdominals a little, which is kind of the hard thing here, this is the tricky part in back bends. And the tricky part to this is that she wants to engage those really subtly. If she starts to engage the core, she's going to feel a little bit more through the gluteus maximus instead of taking it all through the spine. And that's a big part of why we like to use the core when we come into these back bends, so we're not taking all of that extension in the spine, but we're also lifting through the hips and the legs as well. So I'm going to have her think about pressing the pubic bone down, activating lower rectus abdominis, drawing in around the waist, activating transverse abdominis, and now she'll keep that and slowly lift the chest and the legs. And what she should feel is a little bit more through the gluteus maximus in addition to the erector spinae muscles. Great, and she can rest down there. So that's helpful just to play with, and you can experiment with that on your own. But I want you just to feel how different cues can create different things. It's great to come into Shalabhasana and just come up and lift against gravity. You feel the extensors and the whole back of the leg engage. And as I start to articulate that refinement of the abdominals, I might start to feel a little bit more in the glutes so that I can kind of disperse the weight just from the back to really the whole body working together. But really, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to do that, but how you can experiment with different cues to feel different parts of the anatomy more or less. So let's play with another variation on a back bend that's a little bit more passive extension in contrast to this, or at least in relationship to this. And I'm going to have her turn over and come into bridge. Why don't you keep your head down there? Now for this one, you can rest your hips on the ground for a moment there. For this one now, she's going to be lifting against gravity on the front side of her body. So before we had her flipped over and the back side of her body was contracting to lift against gravity. Now gravity is pushing down on the front side of her body here. So when she lifts up, a lot of this is going to be the glutes here lifting her hips up off the ground, and a little less in the erectors, which is really what we experience. The interesting thing about this anatomy thing is we don't always have to overly analyze it in our brain, but really feel it. For most of us, Shalabhasana, we naturally feel a lot of the erectors, and in bridge, we feel a lot of the glutes and the lower legs. So which of the hip muscles are actively contracting here to lift her up? Gluteus maximus. And what are we trying to target within gluteus maximus? Ideally, the lower part, so that we're extending the hips rather than compressing and clenching. Great, come on down. Now, what else is working with gluteus maximus to help her lift the hips up there? We've got a synergist happening there as well. Remember, the hamstrings are going to be part of that. And again, the quadriceps are going to be active. Remember, they're working together to help lift. If I think about the cue of pushing the feet away, the quadriceps are going to engage a little bit more. And I could also tie it into some of the abdominals, that cinching in for what muscle? Transverse abdominis. Now, as she comes into bridge again, if she walks her hands back and clasps the hands, what do we feel stretching now? Remember, we've got now pec major, anterior deltoid, maybe even a little bit of the bicep stretching. In addition to what we haven't talked about already in the hips, stretching through maybe a little bit in the abdominals, a little bit in the hip flexors or the iliopsoas, maybe even rectus femoris here. And then release your clasp and come on down. Great. Now I'm going to have her sit up and come up to set up for camel pose, Ustrasana. So I'll have her face this way. Now, first off, why don't you just sit back on your heels there for a second. Great. So for Ustrasana, before she comes into it here, I want you just to consider for a moment, you can close your eyes if you like, and think about what gets tired in Ustrasana. And part of this will depend on potentially how you come into it, as well as what's stretching. So as she comes up into this here onto her knees, I'm just going to have her come on into it on her own, taking her hands to her heels. The obvious part of this one is what's stretching. So think about what's stretching here, and you might even just see it on her here. Remember, we've got things happening in the shoulders, pec major, anterior delt, and bicep. Again, stretching, along with really all of the abdominals here, as well as what's stretching here in the hips. Remember, we have iliopsoas. We also have rectus femoris stretching as she bends the knees. Great, and then come back up there. Or down, yes. Now let's think about what's engaging. There's a couple of things that are actively engaging to hold us upright and also to position the chest. So as she comes into this next one, I want you to think about first, there's going to be two things in a moment when she comes into it we're going to be thinking about. One is what's engaging in the lower body, and two is what's engaging in the upper body to open and position the chest. So I'll have her come into it here. When we look at this one, the rectus femoris is going to be a big part of what's holding us up because we've got the quadriceps that are drawing the pelvis forward here. And so I've got that eccentric contraction of rectus femoris holding her up. Then in the shoulders, I've got this retraction and extension. So I've got rhomboids, mid-traps, infraspinatus, lats, posterior deltoid, all of these to the back of the shoulder working to open the chest. Right now, to come up, her abdominals and her quads and rectus femoris are really what are going to bring her up. So part of it is the transitions, and part of it is the pose itself. So next, let's have her come into pigeon, right side forward. Now, why don't you stay on your hands there for a second? So there's a few variations here. What primarily is stretching as she comes into pigeon with her hands on the floor? So again, sometimes it's helpful just to imagine yourself in it rather than even looking at it. But remember, the main thing we have stretching here is iliopsoas. What's going to be primarily stretching if she were to bend this leg and grab a hold of her ankle there? With either hand. Remember, rectus femoris now is primarily stretching as she bends the knee as it crosses both of those joints. And she might also feel some stretch through the front of the shoulder. Okay, now she's going to relax there and fold forward. So as she folds forward, now the focus comes to this hip here, her right hip. So what are the muscles that are stretching now on the right side as she folds forward? Remember, we have two main actions happening. One is hip flexion. So as her belly comes toward her thigh, which muscle is she stretching? And that would be gluteus maximus. And as she externally rotates to come into this, the leg has to externally rotate a bit, and that's going to target more of the piriformis, right in the bullseye. Great, now I'll have her come up, and Amanda, I'm going to have you take your both legs forward for Paschimottanasana. Now this one, I'm just going to have her come into it loosely so she can relax there a little bit. This one we know really well. What's the first thing that comes to mind that's stretching here in Paschimottanasana? The first thing we think of is hamstrings. So now let's think of what else is stretching here. So as she flexes the feet, what am I going to be targeting now in the calves? Remember, gastrocnemius crosses the ankle and the knee, so gastrocnemius will be part of that. What's stretching in the hips here is gluteus maximus. Now, depending on the style that you practice and the alignment you take here, some people tend to round the spine or keep it straight. You may or may not feel a stretch through the erector spinae muscles, depending on your body positioning here. What muscles are going to be shortening here to bring us into it? There's a couple, one on the front of the thigh in particular, the quadriceps. Part of that is to extend the legs. And this might not be very vigorous. Again, part of this depends on how you practice this posture, the style that you choose. What's going to be activating to internally rotate her legs toward each other here as she folds forward. Remember, that's our pocket muscle, the TFL, to help internally rotate and adduct the legs. And there might be some engagement in the psoas. For the most part, a lot of what's happening is somewhat passive, though, in relationship to gravity pressing down on her. Great. So come on up, Amanda, and just place the soles of your feet together. Baddha Konasana. So for Baddha Konasana, we've got a couple of things happening again as she starts to fold forward just into a comfortable position there. Remember, her knees are abducting, so they're moving away from the midline. So we're stretching what muscle group? We've got the adductors, and this will change a little bit depending on how far the feet are. As she draws the feet in a little closer or a little further away from her, this might change the angle a little bit in what she feels. We won't overly analyze that too much, but notice that that will change where you feel this. So we've got adductors stretching as the knees point out. And then as she folds forward, remember we also have some external rotation. So she'll also feel this in what muscle? Remember, piriformis. She's also simply flexing the hips. So remember, we said the gluteus maximus isn't often tight. It's not often a muscle you feel stretching a lot. But if it were, she might feel it there as well. And remember, anywhere that she's tight in any of these poses, there's not a right or a wrong answer. Part of it depends on how I set up, what I pay attention to, and my unique body constitution, and where I'm at, what I did that day. So there's not always a right or wrong here, but we're looking at the broad generalities, the majority of what you're going to be feeling. Now, lastly, I'm going to have you turn and face that way and come into double pigeon. So in double pigeon, which would be similar to figure 4 here, where we put the ankle on the knee, as she folds forward, what primarily is she going to be feeling? The knees aren't significantly abducted. They're kind of pretty close to hip width apart, so fairly close to anatomical position. Most of what's happening here is hip flexion and external rotation. For most people, the majority of what they're going to feel is that external rotation because it's pretty significant here in double pigeon. So what's the muscle primarily they would feel, potentially? Piriformis. And then also because she's folding forward and flexing the hips, maybe even potentially gluteus maximus. So hopefully that brings together the information for you in a way that's really relevant as a yoga teacher. Remember, part of this is really based on your experience. It's really fun to look at the anatomy, but the reality is your experience is all that matters. So whether you feel it in one area or not may really depend on the student. But it helps us to kind of analyze and look at the poses so that you can understand the anatomy in more of a living, breathing context. So repeat, look back to the other review sessions. You can go back to any of the videos. Hopefully you've got some note cards and some notes you can refer back to keep learning and getting the information in there. And as you continue to practice on your mat, in your own practice, you can continue to feel and experience it in a way that's really helpful and relevant as a yoga teacher.